The air tasted like ash and regret. My wedding ring felt heavy, a cold brand on my finger as I watched the flashing lights reflect in the rain puddles. The house I had poured my heart and soul into, the home I shared with my daughter and, until recently, her husband, was now a crime scene. They thought they had won. They were wrong. If you have a daughter, sister, or mother you'd do anything for, subscribe now. My name is Claire, and up until a year ago, I thought I had it all. A beautiful home, a loving daughter named Emily, and a peaceful life. Then Emily met Mark. He swept her off her feet, and before I knew it, wedding bells were ringing. I was ecstatic. My little girl had found happiness. Mark seemed like the perfect son-in-law, charming, attentive, and ambitious. He even convinced us that moving in together would be a great idea, a way to save money and build a future. Emily and Mark moved into the guest suite downstairs, initially. Everything was harmonious. I cooked, I cleaned, I kept the house running smoothly. I enjoyed doing it, it was my way of showing my love. But slowly, insidiously, things began to change. Mark started making demands, subtle at first. "Claire, could you do my laundry? I have a big meeting tomorrow." Or, "Claire, Emily's working late. Can you make sure my dinner is ready when I get home?" These requests became expectations, and soon, my life revolved around catering to Mark's every whim. Emily, caught between her husband and her mother, became increasingly distant. She worked long hours, always tired, always stressed. I tried talking to her, but she brushed it off, saying, "Mom, you're overreacting. Mark's just a little demanding, that's all." But it wasn't just a little demanding. It was relentless. He treated me less like a mother-in-law and more like hired help. He'd leave his dishes piled in the sink, his clothes strewn across the floor, fully expecting me to clean up after him. He constantly complained about my cooking, even though he devoured every bite. My own needs, my own desires, were completely ignored. I felt like I was disappearing, fading into the background of my own life. The breaking point came on my birthday. Emily had promised to take me out for dinner, just the two of us. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to reconnect with my daughter. But that evening, Mark announced that he had made reservations at his favorite restaurant, a fancy place I knew I couldn't afford. He insisted that we all go, and Emily, as usual, didn't object. The entire evening, Mark dominated the conversation, bragging about his accomplishments and dismissing anything I had to say. He even made a snide comment about my age, implying that I was past my prime. I tried to hold back tears, but the humiliation was too much. I excused myself from the table and went to the restroom, where I finally allowed myself to cry. When I returned, I saw Mark and Emily whispering to each other, their faces grim. As I approached, I overheard Mark say, "Honestly, Emily, your mother is becoming a burden. She needs to contribute more, or maybe she should just move out." The person I trusted most was one of them. The words hung in the air, sharp and cold as shards of glass. They wanted me gone. My own daughter, swayed by her husband's cruel ambition, was willing to throw me out. I returned to the table, my face composed, but inside, a storm was raging. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I forced a smile, pretended to enjoy the food, but all I could think about was Mark's betrayal and Emily's complicity. That night, sleep evaded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in my mind. How could they do this to me? How could they be so heartless? This wasn't just about the house, it was about family, about loyalty, about love. And they were willing to sacrifice it all for their own selfish desires. The next morning, I woke up with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wouldn't let them win. I wouldn't let them push me out of my own home. I would fight back, but not with anger or confrontation. I would fight back with cunning, with strategy, with a quiet determination that would shock them both. I started by being overly agreeable, almost sickeningly so. I showered Mark with compliments, catered to his every need, and made myself indispensable around the house. I wanted them to think they had broken me, that I was resigned to their demands. But beneath the surface, I was observing, I was planning, I was gathering information. I noticed how Mark would spend hours on his computer in the evenings, often whispering on the phone. I saw Emily becoming increasingly withdrawn, her eyes filled with a sadness she couldn't hide. I listened carefully to their conversations, piecing together fragments of information, searching for weaknesses, for leverage. It wasn't long before I discovered that Mark's ambition was a facade, a carefully constructed lie. He wasn't the successful businessman he claimed to be. He was drowning in debt, gambling away his money, and desperately trying to keep up appearances. Emily, oblivious to the truth, was working herself to the bone to support their lavish lifestyle. The realization of Mark's deception fueled my anger, but it also gave me an idea. If I could expose his lies, if I could reveal his true nature, I could turn Emily against him and reclaim my life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of covert operations. I learned how to use a voice recorder. I started documenting every transaction, every phone call, every suspicious activity. I became a ghost in my own home, silently gathering evidence, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The tension in the house was palpable. Mark grew increasingly arrogant, convinced that he had me under his thumb. He started making bolder demands, even suggesting that I sign over the house to him, claiming it would simplify things for the family. Emily, worn down by stress and exhaustion, became increasingly irritable, snapping at me for the smallest things. I knew I had to act fast, before they completely destroyed what was left of my family. One evening, while Mark was out working late, I decided to confront Emily. I found her in her room, staring blankly at the wall, her face pale and drawn. I sat down beside her and took her hand. "Emily," I said softly, "I know something's wrong. Please, tell me what's going on." At first, she resisted, but eventually, the tears started flowing. She confessed everything: Mark's gambling addiction, his mounting debts, his constant lies. She told me how he had pressured her to take out loans, how he had isolated her from her friends, how he had slowly eroded her self-esteem. As she spoke, my heart broke for my daughter. She had been so blinded by love, so desperate for happiness, that she had allowed herself to be manipulated and controlled. But amidst my sadness, a spark of hope ignited. Emily was finally seeing the truth. Now, I just needed to convince her to take action. I spent hours talking to her that night, sharing my own experiences, offering her my unwavering support. I showed her the evidence I had gathered, the documents, the recordings, the proof of Mark's deceit. At first, she was hesitant, afraid of the consequences. But as she listened to the recordings of Mark's phone calls, as she saw the extent of his financial recklessness, her anger began to simmer. By the end of the night, she was ready to fight back. Together, we formulated a plan that would expose Mark's lies, protect Emily's future, and reclaim my home. It was a risky plan, one that could potentially backfire, but we were willing to take the chance. We knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but we were united in our determination to bring Mark to justice and rebuild our lives. I watched Emily as she made her decision, a steely glint in her eye, the kind I hadn't seen since she was a little girl protecting a friend from a playground bully. This was my daughter, the strong, independent woman I had always known she could be, finally ready to stand up for herself. And I would be right there beside her, every step of the way. We stayed up all night, refining the details, anticipating every possible outcome. As the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow across the room, we looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The game had changed. They thought they had all the power. They were wrong. The hunt had begun. The next day played out like a grotesque parody of our old life. I made Mark his favorite breakfast, pancakes with extra syrup, knowing each bite was fueled by lies. I smiled sweetly as he left for work, the stolen recording device tucked safely in his briefcase, gathering the evidence we needed. Emily, pale but resolute, went to her job, ready to play her part. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock amplifying the dread that gnawed at my insides. What if our plan failed? What if Mark discovered our deception? The consequences were too terrifying to contemplate. As evening approached, the anxiety became unbearable. I paced the floor, replaying every detail in my mind, searching for flaws, for potential pitfalls. When I finally heard Mark's car pull into the driveway, my heart leaped into my throat. This was it. The moment of truth. I took a deep breath, plastered a smile on my face, and prepared to play my role. Mark walked into the house, radiating an air of smug satisfaction. He greeted me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek and asked where Emily was. I told him she was still at work, running late as usual. He grunted in response and headed upstairs, presumably to change. This was our chance. As soon as he was out of sight, I signaled Emily, my hands trembling. We had agreed to meet in the living room, where we would confront him with our evidence. Emily arrived moments later, her face a mask of determination. We stood there in silence, waiting for Mark to come downstairs, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. He sauntered into the room, a predatory glint in his eyes. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Emily stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "We know, Mark," she said. "We know about the gambling, the debts, the lies." His face paled, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. I produced the recording device, holding it up for him to see. "We have proof, Mark," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all right here." He lunged for the recorder, but Emily stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Don't even think about it," she said, her voice hardening. "It's over, Mark. We're done." He glared at us, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can get away with this?" he snarled. "You think you can ruin me?" He took a step towards Emily, his hand raised as if to strike her. That was my breaking point. In a surge of protective fury, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass vase, and swung it at him with all my might. It connected with his head with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The vase shattered into a million pieces, the crimson staining the carpet. Emily and I stared at each other in horror, our faces pale with shock. What had I done? Had I gone too far? Panic set in, threatening to overwhelm me. I didn't mean to hurt him that badly. I just wanted him to stop. To leave us alone. Emily, ever the pragmatist, quickly regained her composure. "We need to call someone," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We need to get him out of here." But as we stood there, paralyzed by fear and indecision, we heard the sound of sirens approaching. Someone must have heard the commotion. In that moment, everything spiraled out of control. The police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the scene like a macabre disco. We were taken into custody, questioned for hours, treated like criminals. Mark, miraculously, survived the blow, but he pressed charges. I was facing serious consequences, potentially years in prison. Emily, devastated and guilt-ridden, could only watch as my life unraveled. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, court appearances, and tearful conversations with Emily. I lost my job, my reputation, my sense of security. I felt like I was drowning, sinking deeper and deeper into a sea of despair. Mark, fueled by vengeance, seemed determined to destroy me. He painted me as a violent, unstable woman, a threat to society. He twisted the truth, manipulated the evidence, and used his influence to turn everyone against me. Even some of my friends and family began to doubt me, wondering if I was capable of such violence. I felt utterly alone, abandoned, and betrayed. One day, sitting in my jail cell, staring at the cold, gray walls, I reached my lowest point. I had lost everything. My home, my daughter's respect, my freedom, it was all gone. The weight of my mistakes, the consequences of my actions, pressed down on me with crushing force. For a moment, I considered giving up, surrendering to the darkness, letting Mark win. But then, a flicker of defiance ignited within me. I thought of Emily, her face etched with sadness and regret. I couldn't let Mark destroy her too. I had to fight back, not for myself, but for her. I realized that I still had one weapon left, the truth. I may have lost everything else, but I still had the power to expose Mark's lies, to reveal his true nature to the world. It wouldn't be easy. He had powerful allies, deep pockets, and a ruthless determination to silence me. But I was no longer afraid. I had faced the abyss, and I had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever before. From that moment on, I resolved to fight. I would use every resource at my disposal, every connection I had, every ounce of my strength to bring Mark to justice and clear my name. I started by reaching out to a former colleague, a journalist I trusted implicitly. I told her everything, from the beginning, laying bare the full extent of Mark's deception and my own role in the events that had transpired. She listened patiently, her eyes widening with each revelation. At first, she was skeptical, but as I presented her with the evidence, the documents, the recordings, she began to believe me. She agreed to investigate, to dig deeper, to uncover the truth. It was a long shot, a risky gamble, but it was my only hope. As I sat there, waiting for her to return, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in months. I knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but I was no longer afraid. I had a purpose, a mission, a reason to keep fighting. Mark may have thought he had broken me, that he had silenced me for good. But he was wrong. The storm was just beginning. The journalist, Sarah, turned out to be a godsend. She was relentless. She started digging, pulling at the threads of Mark's carefully constructed web of lies. She interviewed former colleagues, business partners, even disgruntled clients, piecing together a damning portrait of a man consumed by greed and deceit. She uncovered evidence of fraudulent business practices, shady deals, and offshore accounts, all meticulously hidden beneath a veneer of respectability. But the most crucial piece of evidence came from the recording device we had planted in Mark's briefcase. Sarah had it forensically analyzed, extracting hours of incriminating conversations, including admissions of guilt, threats, and attempts to cover his tracks. It was a treasure trove of information, enough to bring him down. The problem was getting it out there. Mark had powerful friends in high places, people who were willing to protect him at all costs. Sarah knew that if she tried to publish the story through traditional channels, it would be suppressed, buried, or discredited. We needed a different approach, something bold, something unconventional, something that would bypass the gatekeepers and go straight to the public. That's when we came up with the idea of leaking the information online. We decided to create an anonymous website, a digital repository for all the evidence we had gathered. Sarah, with her technical expertise, built the site herself, ensuring it was secure, untraceable, and resistant to hacking. We uploaded all the documents, recordings, and financial records, along with a detailed account of Mark's crimes and my own story. We called the site The Truth About Mark, a simple but effective title that captured the essence of our mission. The next challenge was to get people to visit the site. We couldn't just launch it and hope for the best. We needed to create a buzz, to generate interest, to make people curious enough to click on the link. Sarah suggested using social media, spreading the word through anonymous accounts, targeting specific groups and communities who would be most receptive to our message. We created a series of cryptic posts, hinting at a scandal, promising to reveal the truth about a prominent businessman. We used hashtags and keywords to maximize our reach, and we carefully timed our posts to coincide with peak traffic hours. It was a risky strategy, but it was our best shot. We knew that if we could get enough people to see the site, the truth would eventually come out. The first few days were agonizing. We monitored the site traffic constantly, watching the numbers slowly climb. At first, it was just a trickle, a few curious onlookers clicking on the link. But then, as more and more people started sharing our posts, the traffic began to surge. People were reading the story, listening to the recordings, examining the evidence. They were commenting, sharing, and debating. The website was going viral. The news spread like wildfire, from social media to online forums to mainstream media outlets. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Mark, about his crimes, about his lies. The pressure on him and his powerful friends became immense. They tried to discredit us, to dismiss the website as a hoax, to silence our voices. But it was too late. The truth was out there, and it couldn't be contained. The police, facing mounting public pressure, were forced to reopen the investigation into Mark's activities. The district attorney, sensing an opportunity, launched a grand jury investigation. Mark's world was crumbling around him. He lost his job, his reputation, and his friends. His business empire collapsed, his assets were frozen, and he was facing the prospect of serious prison time. The day Mark was arrested was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. I watched the news coverage from my jail cell, a small smile playing on my lips. He looked defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken. He finally understood the consequences of his actions. But the fight wasn't over yet. I still had to clear my name, to prove my innocence in the assault case. Sarah, with her relentless determination, continued to investigate, digging deeper into the events that had led to the altercation. She interviewed witnesses, examined the crime scene photos, and consulted with legal experts. She discovered that Mark had a history of violence, that he had been accused of physical altercations in the past, but that the cases had been quietly settled out of court. She also found evidence that he had deliberately provoked me, knowing that I was vulnerable and emotionally distressed. She presented this evidence to my lawyer, who used it to build a strong case in my defense. The trial was a media circus, with reporters and cameras crowding the courtroom. Mark, desperate to salvage his reputation, tried to portray me as a violent, unstable woman who had attacked him without provocation. But the truth was on my side. My lawyer skillfully dismantled his lies, exposing his deceit and manipulation. The jury, after deliberating for hours, returned a verdict of not guilty. I was finally free. The journalist Sarah, who had become more than just a colleague but a true confidant, discovered Mark's Achilles heel, a secret that he had guarded more fiercely than his money or his reputation. It wasn't a financial misdeed, nor an affair, but something far more sinister and deeply personal. She found evidence linking him to a series of shell corporations designed not just for hiding funds, but for something far more sinister: blackmail. He had been systematically gathering compromising information on influential people, politicians, judges, even some of his so-called friends, and using it to manipulate them. This was the leverage he used to get away with so much for so long. The list was extensive, a veritable who's who of the city's elite, all puppets dancing to Mark's tune. But within this trove of secrets, Sarah found something that made my blood run cold: evidence that Mark had been systematically sabotaging my father's business years ago, driving him into financial ruin and contributing to his early passing. He had disguised it as a series of unfortunate market shifts, but it was a calculated act of destruction, fueled by a petty grievance from decades prior. My father, a kind and honest man, had unknowingly become a pawn in Mark's twisted game. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The anger I felt before was a flicker compared to the inferno that now raged within me. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about my father, about avenging his memory and the injustice he suffered. I told Sarah we couldn't just expose him, we had to make him pay for every single life he had ruined, every tear he had caused. We devised a plan, a carefully orchestrated trap designed to ensnare Mark in his own web of deceit. We knew he would be desperate to contain the damage, to silence us before we could expose his network of blackmail. He would likely try to bribe us, threaten us, or even resort to more drastic measures. We decided to use his desperation against him, to lure him into a situation where he would be forced to reveal the full extent of his crimes. Sarah, using her contacts in the media, leaked a carefully crafted story hinting at the existence of the blackmail network, but without revealing any specific names or details. The story was vague enough to pique Mark's interest but alarming enough to send him into a frenzy. We knew he would try to find the source of the leak, to identify who was threatening to expose him. We made sure that the trail led back to me, or rather, to a carefully constructed online persona that appeared to be acting alone. We created fake email accounts, anonymous social media profiles, and even a burner phone, all designed to reinforce the illusion that I was the sole orchestrator of this campaign. We wanted Mark to believe that he was dealing with a lone, vengeful woman, someone he could easily manipulate or intimidate. We knew he underestimated me, and that was his fatal mistake. The bait was set. Now, we just had to wait. It didn't take long. Within days, I received an anonymous message, a cryptic invitation to a meeting at a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. The message was carefully worded, promising a resolution to our dispute in exchange for my silence. I knew it was Mark. He was playing right into our hands. I informed Sarah, and we meticulously planned every detail of the meeting, anticipating every possible scenario. We equipped me with a hidden camera and microphone, ensuring that every word, every gesture, would be recorded. We also arranged for a team of investigators, including some of Sarah's trusted contacts, to be nearby, ready to intervene if things went sideways. I knew I was walking into a dangerous situation, but I was determined to see this through. I had come too far to turn back now. The day of the meeting arrived, and I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I dressed in simple clothes, trying to appear vulnerable and unassuming. I wanted Mark to underestimate me, to let his guard down. As I drove to the location, a deserted warehouse on the edge of town, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would act. I knew I had to remain calm, collected, and in control, even as I faced the man who had destroyed my life and taken my father from me. The warehouse was even more desolate than I had imagined, a crumbling concrete structure surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken fences. As I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The only light came from a few grimy windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. I saw Mark standing in the center of the warehouse, his face pale and drawn. He was surrounded by two burly men, their eyes cold and menacing. He motioned for me to come closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I was hoping you would be reasonable," he said, his eyes fixed on me. "This doesn't have to get ugly. Just tell me what you want, and we can make this all go away." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I want the truth, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I want everyone to know what you've done, the lives you've ruined, the people you've betrayed." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You think you can stop me? You think you can expose me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." He signaled to his men, and they stepped forward, their faces grim. "Let's not make this difficult," he said, his voice hardening. "Just hand over the evidence, and we can forget this ever happened." I stood my ground, my eyes locked on his. "It's too late for that, Mark," I said. "The truth is already out there. And it's only a matter of time before everyone knows the real you." His face contorted with rage. "You stubborn." He began, but before he could finish his sentence, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The doors burst open, and a team of armed officers stormed inside. "Police! Freeze!" they shouted. Mark and his men were caught completely off guard, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. The trap had been sprung. But as the officers moved to apprehend them, Mark lunged at me, his eyes blazing with fury. He grabbed me by the throat, his fingers tightening around my windpipe. "If I'm going down," he hissed, "I'm taking you with me." The air seemed to thicken as Mark's grip tightened, my vision tunneling. Spots danced before my eyes, a desperate cough escaped my lips, and panic clawed at my throat. I clawed at his hands, but his grip was like iron. Just when the darkness threatened to consume me, a deafening crack split the air. One of the officers, seeing Mark's attack, had used his stun gun. Mark convulsed, his body rigid, and he released me. I gasped, sucking in precious air as I stumbled back, my throat burning. The officers swarmed him, handcuffing him as he lay groaning on the floor. As I stood there, catching my breath, Sarah rushed to my side, her face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded weakly, my hand still clutching my throat. "I'm okay," I managed to croak. "He's finished." The recording, of course, was crystal clear. Mark's confession, his threats, his violent attack, it was all captured on tape, irrefutable proof of his guilt. The evidence, combined with the testimony of the officers and the mountain of evidence Sarah had uncovered, was overwhelming. He didn't stand a chance. The trial was swift and brutal. Mark's lawyers tried to argue that he was acting in self-defense, that I had provoked him, but the evidence spoke for itself. The jury saw him for what he was, a manipulative, ruthless man who would stop at nothing to protect his power and wealth. He was found guilty on all counts: extortion, fraud, conspiracy, and assault. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty, 25 years in prison. As the verdict was read, I watched Mark's face crumble. The arrogance, the self-assurance, the sense of invincibility, it all vanished, replaced by a look of utter despair. He finally understood that he wasn't above the law, that his actions had consequences. As he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to me, his eyes filled with hatred. "You haven't won," he spat. "This isn't over." I simply smiled. It was over for him. His empire had crumbled, his reputation was ruined, and he was going to spend the best years of his life behind bars. He had lost everything. The fallout was immense. The exposure of Mark's blackmail network sent shockwaves through the city's elite. Politicians resigned in disgrace, judges were impeached, and powerful business leaders were brought down. The city was in turmoil, but it was a necessary cleansing. The truth had been revealed, and the corrupt were being held accountable. As for me, I was finally able to clear my name in the assault case. With Mark's conviction, the charges against me were dropped. I was free to rebuild my life, to move on from the nightmare that had consumed me for so long. I knew it wouldn't be easy. The scars of the past would always be with me, but I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. I had faced my demons, and I had emerged stronger than ever. In the aftermath, I found myself reflecting on the entire ordeal. The pain, the betrayal, the fear, it had all been worth it. I had sought justice, not just for myself, but for my father, for all the people Mark had harmed. I had exposed his lies, brought him to justice, and reclaimed my life. It was a long and arduous journey, but I wouldn't have changed a thing. One evening, Sarah and I sat on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. "It's over," she said, her voice filled with relief. "He can't hurt anyone anymore." I nodded, a sense of peace washing over me. "No," I replied. "He can't." I looked at Sarah, my heart filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you," I said. "You were my rock, my confidant, my friend." She smiled, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "We did it together," she said. "We brought him down." I thought about Mark, locked away in his prison cell, his life in ruins. I felt no sympathy for him, only a sense of satisfaction. He had reaped what he had sown. He had destroyed my life, and I had destroyed his. Revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. It's a reckoning, a way to reclaim what was stolen. It's not about hatred, but about justice. It's about standing up for yourself and for those who can't. It's about saying enough is enough. And in my case, it was about honoring my father's memory and avenging the wrongs he had suffered. As I looked out at the horizon, I knew that the storm had finally passed. The sun was rising on a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, healing, and the promise of a brighter future. The nightmare was over. They lost everything. I just smiled. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more justice.